library, such a beautiful room. Thank you all for inviting me here. I've had a full day in East Hampton. It's been a great day. I woke up early this morning. I live just, 50 miles north of the Bronx where I work. And I visited Marjorie Rosen, who is a great board member of the New York Botanical Garden and a great gardener, and enjoyed her roses. And then I went to a nice lecture that was co-hosted by the Nature Conservancy and the East Hampton Garden Club on pollinators. And then I had a lovely lunch with Janet and some friends. And Janet is a truly dedicated board member of the garden. And I first met her many years ago when we'd wander around the now Ross Conifer Arboretum at the New York Botanical Garden, and I would argue with Arthur about the identity of certain pines. And those are arguments that I cherished. It's always fun to find another person who is obsessed with trees, as I am. So I'll get going quickly. I'm under strict time limits. I love the topic. I love the garden. And I've been thinking a lot about the topic that I'll be presenting tonight. So first, a little background about the New York Botanical Garden. It's in New York. It's in the Bronx. It's 250 acres. And it was established by an act of the state legislature in 1891. Its founding director was a man named Nathaniel Britton, the attractive bearded man on the left-hand side of the screen. And along with his wife, Elizabeth Gertrude Knight Britton, about whom I'll talk about a little more down the road. And it was established to be New York's version of the Royal Botanic Garden Kew in London. And it was established at a time when the great cultural institutions of New York City, the museum, the Met, the AMNH, the zoo, were all established by great citizens of New York, because it was felt that in order for New York to be taken seriously amongst the world's great cities, it needed great cultural institutions. So we were the garden established to fill that role. And by that, it means that we were a garden that was established to pursue a three-part mission of botanical science. Many people who visited the garden, and a show of hands, who's not been to the garden? Only a handful of you. Oh, terrible people. Well, hopefully we can convince you. I mean, I drove from 50 miles north of the garden today, so you guys can make the trip. It's worth making. Hopefully I don't turn you off. But for those who do visit the garden, you visit because it's a beautiful place, generally, but you might not realize that the garden is one of the world's great scientific institutions devoted to the study of plants, and ultimately, through that study, the conservation of plants. Traditionally in the New World tropics, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, and in North America, but truly globally now. And we study everything there is to study about plants. We have about 40 PhD botanists on staff and another 40 or so students at any given time. It's really a wonderful place to learn about plants, particularly if you're a student. The second part of the troika is education. The garden is an educational institution. We serve 90,000 New York City school children each year through our programs, 5,000 adult education students, anywhere from, again, 30 or 40 students who study with our scientists and get their PhDs from one of 6 regional universities. It really is a great place to learn about plants and to get engaged in the beauty of plants and nature. And of course, there's horticulture, the third part of the three-part mission. So science, education, and horticulture. And very much horticulture, or the growing of plants at the garden, was established to serve the science and the education programs. And the classic kind of 19th century model for a botanical garden, it wasn't designed to be a beautiful place. It was designed to be an inspiring place and an informative place. And plants from around the world were assembled in the Bronx starting in the late 1800s in order to give people the opportunity to study and compare pines from Asia and Europe and North America, orchids from the New World tropics or the Old World tropics, and so on and so forth. And to grow those plants across our 250 acres, we have 2 lovely glasshouses. This is the Enid A. Haupt Conservatory, where we grow plants from primarily the New World tropics. But we also have a wonderful series of exhibitions, and at the garden right now is our Frida Kahlo Art, Garden, and Life exhibition, a wonderful combination between an exhibition of 14 of her works of art in our library gallery, and a living exhibition that celebrates her garden, the garden that she created with Diego Rivera in Mexico City at the Casa Azul, as well as wonderful programs and activities. For the first time in my career at the garden, at the end of a long, hard day of work, I can get a shot of tequila. And believe me, I deeply appreciate that often. And of course, gardens, display gardens. This seasonal walk, which was designed by Pete Oudoff, it just opened about a year ago. This is a project that Marjorie Rosen helped us out with a great deal. But display gardens also including the great Beatrix Farron designed rose garden, designed in 1916, the native plant garden that I'll talk about, our rock garden, and so on and so forth. And incredible trees. I was, before I became vice president for horticulture, the curator of the tree collections, and it's the best place in the world to be curator of a collection of trees, because there's this great combination of this historic native trees that well predate the establishment of the garden, and then trees amassed from all across the globe, including the conifer arboretum, which has wonderful trees like this weeping variety of Pinus coriensis, the Korean nut pine, and flowering cherries that were planted in the 1940s that kind of bedazzled the landscape and spring. So incredible design gardens, incredible curated collections, incredible glasshouses and architecture, but probably most people don't think of the garden as also an incredible place to experience nature. And in fact, nature was the reason why the garden was established on its current site in 1895. The institution was established in 1891, and the site was chosen in 1895 because of what was then called the 50-acre hemlock grove and the Bronx River, which Nathaniel Britton felt were wonderful kind of foundational elements for the outdoor classroom the garden was to become, great places to teach people about the diversity and complexity and fragility of plants. So today's talk, this evening's talk, will be about how using nature at the garden, we're starting to think about how we as an institution and we as individuals can start to kind of undo some of the damage that humans have wrought, particularly in terms of biodiversity. So I tried to come up with the most grandiose title as possible. How'd I do? It's grandiose, right? It's also maybe overpromises a bit. But the idea is that through two separate projects at the garden, the restoration of the 50-acre Thain Family Forest, and the creation of our new native plant garden, which opened in 2013, at least I am starting to think differently about the role that people can play in preserving or even enhancing the biodiversity, the plant biodiversity particularly, that sits at the center of all life on this planet. Again, only slightly grandiose, but here we go. So first of all, let's talk about widespread environmental change. This is a wonderful book called Mannahatta. It's the result of a research project by Eric Sanderson at the Bronx Zoo, the Wildlife Conservation Society. And he's been reconstructing what New York City was like pre-European settlement, pre-1609, pre-Henry Hudson. And he's doing this with the magic of GIS and computer software and computer imaging. But it's pretty incredible to look and to think about. We in wandering around the streets of Manhattan, don't really think about what that landscape might have been like, say, 400 years ago. He's reconstructed for us. So that's pretty stark environmental change. It's no wonder that you don't sort of stumble upon Trillium in the middle of Fifth Avenue, because it's really different now than it was. But the world is different in ways that aren't so easy to see. The next two slides are from Richard Hobbs, who is a restoration ecologist from Australia. He's actually from Scotland, but he teaches in Australia, who's been thinking a lot about human-induced change, anthropogenic change, and the landscape. And if you can't read these, I'll note some of them. So this is changes, measurable changes, quantitatively measurable changes in human activity since 1750, between 1750 and 2000. And you go from 0 McDonald's in 1750 to about 35,000 McDonald's today. You go from a world population of less than 1 billion to a world population of approaching 7 billion, and so on and so forth. And these are massive changes. Something very interesting to note that if you look at where all these curves inflect, they go up sharply, it's all around about 1950, whatever the measure is, right? So these are massive changes that are very recent. So if we think about the impacts of those changes on nature and on the world, we don't even really understand what those impacts will be, because these changes are all happening right now and accelerating right now. And then you can start to measure, because of all those changes in human activity, changes in the Earth system. So if you look at the lower right-hand quarter, it went from 0 extinctions in 1750 to somewhere around 20,000 extinctions in the year 2000. If you look at nitrous oxide concentration, around 270 parts per billion to nearly 310, and so on and so forth. So with all of those great changes in human activity, there have become these great changes in the global environment, in biogeochemical systems. So you've gone from the physical changes, which you don't think about so much, but are quite easy to understand, to these kind of chemical and process changes that are happening all around us all the time. It's kind of terrifying, actually, to look at these slides, because again, you have these spikes and these changes in systems. And I know there's been some news recently about nitrates, about nitrogen pollution in local waterways, things that haven't been seen before recently. And imagine that on a global scale. And you start to think why maybe we want to think about sustaining nature in a time of widespread environmental change, however grandiose that sounds. Other measures, inorganic nitrogen deposition. This is a direct consequence of the burning of fossil fuels, of air pollution, spiking, particularly in the areas around major industrial centers around this country. Of course, the models of a temperature change as a result of climate change. A somewhat complicated slide, but I'll simplify it. The black is observed changes in temperature since 1900, around 2 degrees of warming since 1970. It's kind of spiked very quickly. The red line at the top is what that might be if we continue to act the way that we've been acting in terms of consuming fossil fuels and doing all the sort of profligate things that we do. The orange line in the middle is if we start right now being conservationists. Every single one of us in every city across the US and every country across the world started to behave as if our actions had a long-term impact on the global environment. So that's the best we can hope for. And of course, what does that mean? This is a wonderful graphic. This came from David Wolf, Cameron Wake, who's a climatologist from New Hampshire. And quite graphically, again, if you look at that higher emission standard, in 2100, the end of this century, the tri-state area will feel like the border between South Carolina and Georgia. There's a reason why I don't go to South Carolina and Georgia in August. So I'm really hoping that these are all models. It could be completely wrong. It's just math and projections. But again, all those other measurable things, those measurable changes, that's just data. That's what's happened. And of course, back to the sort of the most obvious changes, that's the New Jersey Turnpike. I grew up in New Jersey. I'm very proud of the New Jersey Turnpike. That mess that you drive by when you're going to DC or Philadelphia or better places, that mess is what allows the lifestyles that we all have. And that's something that you see and you don't think about, but it's all around you. And then, of course, the great white-tailed deer, which most people are starting to understand as having a subtle but lasting impact on nature. So here are a whole set of changes. And here we have, so that's from the global to the local. These are all things that we hope all of you all can understand. And I remain undaunted. And I remain optimistic because I've had the great fortune over the past 17 years or so of working at the New York Botanical Garden, specifically working in and around the Thain Family Forest, which is the 50-acre forest at the heart of the garden, which is the reason why the garden was established on its site in 1895. A magical place. Nathaniel Britton, not a romantic fellow, a kind of a dictator by all accounts, a brilliant scientist, not a lot of fun to be around, But even he really romanticized the forest. He understood that it is a wonderful resource for teaching people about plants. Excuse me, but he also understood that it's a beautiful place, that it was a beautiful place. Go back in time to the late 19th century. And he wasn't alone in feeling that way. This is the Bronx River, which runs through the New York Botanical Garden, which runs through our forest. This is a painting from the middle of the 19th century by a kind of mid-level Hudson River painter named William Rickerby Miller. And apparently, exactly the spot that is now the New York Botanical Garden and the Thain Family Forest was a popular destination for early Hudson River School painters. It's a little harder to get up to, West Point. A little bit easier if you're living in Brooklyn to get to the Bronx, which was then in Westchester. Romantic, that's New York City circa 1860. And here's a wonderful description of why the forest, or a part of a description of why the forest has remained the way it has. The garden's land was owned by a variety of landowners over time until we took it over in the 1890s. But the biggest chunk of time it was owned by the Lorillard family from 1792 to 1870. Do you all know who the Lorillards were? Are there any Lorillards in the room? You're in East Hampton, you never know. Well, anyway, the Lorillards were America's first industrial dynasty. They were the DuPonts or the Fords of the 18th century. And they sold tobacco. They actually sold, they were famous for inventing the cigar store Indian, one of the first marketing efforts of any sort in this country, in the world. And they sold a lot of tobacco to Europeans in the form of snuff. And they moved to the site that is now the garden in 1792 because they had outgrown their Lower Manhattan factory site. And not only did they build their factory on the banks of the Bronx River, but they also built their home there. And they preserved the forest. They were way ahead of their time. They were the Nature Conservancy before the Nature Conservancy existed. They appreciated the beauty of this landscape, and they protected this landscape. And they spent time in this landscape, and they loved it. And we are all the beneficiaries of that passion for nature that they showed. After the Lorillards left in the 1870s, the land that is now the garden and now the Thain Family Forest was a bit in limbo. But there was a great muck-raking New York journalist named John Mullally, after whom there is a park named in New York, who wrote a great book called New Parks Beyond the Harlem. It might even be in the collections of this library. But it was equal part very powerful economic argument for preserving open space and creating parkland in New York City, and very purple prose about the beauty of some of the land that he hoped would be preserved as parkland. He called for the creation of 4,000 acres of parkland in what is now the Bronx. It was partially New York City, partially Westchester County when he wrote this book. And there had been great debate in the New York City legislature about whether or not this land should be preserved as parkland. And he cited the economic benefits garnered by the people who lived around Central Park, because he was fighting against the people who said, this is 4,000 acres, think of how much that could be sold for as real estate. And he said, yes, that's true, that's its value now, but think of how much the real estate around Central Park will appreciate because it's around Central Park. And then he made great arguments, as the same arguments that Olmsted made in creating Central Park. Think of how necessary it will be to have lungs of the city, to have a place where the workers who cannot get on the jitney and go to East Hampton on their weekends can spend time and picnic with their families and breathe clean air, et cetera, et cetera. So he made a great impassioned case, and indeed that land was all set aside as parkland, which is why today the Bronx has more park than any other borough. And here's a lovely line, I'll read it. It would be difficult to do justice to the exquisite loveliness of the tract. This is about the very land that would become the Botanical Garden, without seeming to exaggerate. For the character of the scenery is so varied that every step is a surprise, and the artist and the wayfaring man might love to linger there. It's about 300 pages of that kind of thing. It's quite fun to read. And of course, after it became a part of the New York Botanical Garden, the forest in particular, the Hemlock Grove, was called the most precious possession of the city of New York. And this was in the early 20th century. So it was already celebrated as a magnificent example of nature at the edge of the city and then within the city in the 19th century. Imagine how important it must be in the 21st century. And then lastly, the Olmsted brothers, who are the sons of Frederick Olmsted, who did a great report on the garden and argued and actually made a plan to make the garden more beautiful, to transform it from this very scientific place to a more beautiful place. In their final report, they basically said that no matter what you do, don't screw up the forest, because it was magical. This is a Sanford Gifford painting, also from the middle of the 19th century, of the Bronx River. So there you have it. I just set the scale. The garden, because the forest was primeval, because it was so beautiful, felt the best thing to do in the forest was to do nothing. The then accepted policies or theory of ecology was that ecosystems would start off a blank slate and they would change over time until they became climax ecosystems, that they were the best examples of what they could possibly be. Hemlocks are the classic climax species. The forest is mostly hemlocks or largely hemlocks. Therefore, it's reached its climax state. It is perfect. Don't screw around. And that was the best scientific thought of the day. That was the right thing to do. Almost immediately, the impacts of human activity could be felt on this primeval, beautiful landscape. Almost immediately, changes were seen. The first and most dramatic was the loss of the chestnuts. You've all heard of chestnut blight. Did you all know that chestnut blight was discovered at the Bronx Zoo in 1904? And it was named and described by a mycologist, a fungus expert at the New York Botanical Garden, who just went across the street. They were seeing their chestnuts decline, and then he came back across the street to the garden and noticed that, yes, in the forest, too, our chestnuts were declining, and like wildfire, this disease spread up and down the East Coast, and the chestnuts were all but gone by the 1930s. So that's the first indication that this primeval, magical place of nature might need a little help. It's not just introduced pathogens that cause damage. The garden's program itself caused some problems for the health of the forest. This is a photograph of 410 jacks in the pulpit that were confiscated from a school group who was leaving the garden in 1911, confiscated by Elizabeth Gertrude Knight Britton, who had to live with Nathaniel Lord Britton and had developed a certain degree of toughness of her own. And I would hate to be those children or their teacher when she stopped them at the gate and grabbed the jacks in the pulpit. But that's just something that's interesting. It was the tragedy of the commons. It's a beautiful place with these beautiful things. Let's dig them up and get rid of them. And that's part of the problem, or part of the challenge, I should say, of nature in the current world, is that not everybody understands its fragility, and not everybody understands its value. This is a wonderful letter written to Elizabeth Gertrude Knight Britton by the director of the Bronx Zoo about Epigea repens, which is a wonderful wildflower. And again, I'll read it. It's harder. I'll read it from here if I can. My eyes are going. So basically, this is one of the wonderful wildflowers that grew spontaneously in the forest and in the wooded portions of the Bronx Zoo. And it was disappearing for the reasons that we've just discussed. And so she found a population in the zoo and suggested that they protect them. And he wrote, there are numerous practical difficulties in the way of fence protection. This is to protect the remaining populations of this rare plant. It will not do to attract attention to the plants, because if we should do so, nothing but a steel bar cage would be adequate to keep off the vandals. However, something must be done. That is clear. Barbed wire would be nice if it were not against the law and very fruitful of damage suits. It's 1924 to try to protect the last remaining individuals of a charismatic small wildflower growing in the forest. And there's this. This is a lovely idyllic picture of a man in the hemlock grove enjoying the shade of these grand old trees. There's nothing bad about this, right? There's nothing damaging about this. He's just passively enjoying. He's not digging any plants up. We don't think he's introducing any pathogens. But the garden really determined that the hemlocks that had defined this forest for many generations were not regenerating There were lots of big old hemlocks and very few small young hemlocks. And the thought was they were not regenerating largely because of soil compaction. Because one hatted man is probably not so bad, but 100 a day for 30 or 40 years, you start to compact the soil, and you all know what happens with soil compaction. So they had to put signs out begging people to stay on the paths. There were paths through the forest. But people, again, the tragedy of the commons, they didn't make the connection in their minds that wandering off to go follow that owl or to go look what that flower was might not be good for the long-term health of the ecosystem. So they were doing what they could. And then there's some things that have changed over time that you wouldn't expect. The New York Botanical Garden in general and the forest in particular are squirrel heaven. And if you go measure the squirrels, this is from a publication in the early 1980s, typically you'd have 2.5 to 7.5 squirrels. I don't know exactly how you have a half a squirrel, but you get the idea per hectare, which is what, 2.5 acres, 2.2 acres. At the garden, you find 45 to 51. So because there are so many yummy squirrel treats and there are so few squirrel predators. So you can imagine if you're something that disperses and grows because of seeds, acorns, hickory nuts, there are almost no young hickories or oaks in the forest because there are so many squirrels in the forest. And the things you can't see so much, but you can measure, heavy metals. Everything that goes up in the air in Manhattan or along the Jersey Turnpike comes down in the rain in the Bronx, right? We have the prevailing winds come in that direction, and it's just part of being in an urban area. So if you test our soils, or soils really anywhere in New York City, you'll find that concentrations of heavy metals, which don't move very well through the soils once they're deposited, are very high. We're not exactly sure what the impacts of these heavy metals are on plant growth or on life in the forest, but chances are they're substantial. Copper, lead, zinc, and nickel. You did not memorize your periodic table of the elements before you came here? I'll tell you. Okay, so those are things that you can't see, things that you see with a trained eye. Everyone has heard of hemlock woolly adelgid. Remember that the forest was called the hemlock grove because it had these stands of mature ancient hemlocks. The forest is not called the hemlock grove anymore. The winds of Hurricane Gloria, I believe 1985, I'm sure you guys are very down with hurricane years, brought the adelgid over into the Bronx, actually from Long Island. And there are a few living hemlocks in the forest. Remember, there was no hemlock regeneration, so there were no young ones. But there are very few. There were about 100 at last count, down from a few thousand. That's the adelgid. And it's working its way up through the region, the adelgid. And then things that if you really know what you're looking at will cause nothing but horror or concern, and it's a proliferation of invasive exotic species, many of which came from the garden itself, some of which are regional invasives that are distributed or dispersed by birds, but they're all over the place, or they were all over the place in the forest. And of course, they're taking up growing space that would otherwise be used by native plants, wildflowers, trees, shrubs. Substantial change in the forest. Two of the worst are knotweed and lesser celandine. Everyone knows knotweed. We've all been trained to hate knotweed. Do you all know lesser celandine? It is a truly terrifying plant. It is the brilliantly yellow flower clothing the floodplain of the Bronx River in that right-hand image. And it just chokes out. It's a spring ephemeral. It's impossible to manage chemically and mechanically. It's just very, very, very difficult to control. And it just does that. And nothing else other than knotweed will actually grow through it. If you want a sustainable garden, you want a low-maintenance garden, that is your low-maintenance garden. The deer do not eat either of these. We're blessed in the garden that we don't really have deer. We have the occasional deer from time to time.
Can we send you some?
Sure. Sure, but I'll chase them out into the street, so I hope you're not one of those people who doesn't want deer culling, because I'd work on it. But we have everything else, so I mean, give us a break, you know. You guys don't have angry squirrel hordes like we have. But anyway, these are things that have a huge impact on the ecology, huge impact. This is completely changed. It's a floodplain forest, often one of the most diverse assemblages of plants you would expect. Wildflowers, shrubs, trees, because of the changing soils. It's great. All these kind of micro habitats and things that you find in a floodplain, all bulldozed, biologically bulldozed by lesser celandine and knotweed. And of course, we've seen the impacts. In the late 1890s, the garden was established by botanists. What do botanists do when they get a new house or new property? They tell you what grows there. They go out and they inventory, right? That's what they do, first and foremost. Professional inventoriers of plants. And so they did these wonderful inventories pretty regularly throughout the garden's history, early history. So you can go back and get a record. You can understand what was here. We also have an herbarium where when they inventory, they write it down, but they also take an herbarium voucher, which goes into our giant herbarium, and you have a permanent record of that actual plant there. And so if you look at the flora of the forest today versus the flora of the forest in the late 19th century, the total number of species has reduced. These are spontaneous flowering plant species, not planted. They're not counted here. In 1898, 82.8% of the flora of the garden were native. Today, it's just 58.2% of the flora. The number of invasive species has changed, doubled from 96 roughly to 184. And there were 6 species that were particularly singled out in the document that suggested that the garden site be used for the current site for the garden be used for the garden. Of those 6 species, only 1 remains. You know, because they said, oh, it's a great place, it's got this and that and the other thing. Well, not so much anymore. The change is obvious, again, if you look at certain ways. So I won't bore you with the details here. This is based on importance value. So if you look at these bar graphs, the higher the importance value, basically the more abundant, the more dominant the species is. So if you look at the forest in 1937, and you look at things with a diameter at breast height, 4.5 feet off the ground, of 6 inches or more, in 1937 and 2006, oaks are the most, collectively oaks are the most important, ecologically important. If you look in 1937, hemlocks are very important. In 2006, all but gone. You heard about the adelgid and other things, neurogeneration. And then there's this funny thing called cork tree, which isn't on the map in 1937, but is measurable in 2006. Cork tree is an Asian species, Philodendron amurense, not very well known or understood, not widely planted. It's the tree version of lesser celandine. It is the perfect weed. It's bird dispersed. It grows in sun or shade. It grows in wet or dry. You can't kill it. There are no natural predators. It's a scary thing. And it was planted in the garden, and it came into the forest from the garden. So that's looking at things that are 6 inches diameter at breast height or larger. If you look at less than 2 inches diameter, oak's importance is almost negligible, hemlocks is 0, and cork tree is 19. So this is in 2006. So what does that tell you about the forest in 50 years if you do nothing? Completely different. So the native forest that was the hemlock grove, that was still dominated by native species, that was filled with charismatic, interesting wildflowers, that was the reason why the garden was established where it was, just by doing nothing, by letting nature do her best, you would have a forest of basically invasive species, another generation. So that, of course, inspired us to act. A lot has changed about who we are and what we know and what we do, and we're the beneficiaries. Our generation, are the beneficiaries of all of this work over time. And my degree is in forest ecology. I went to forestry school. I was the curator of the tree collections. So they assumed I must know something about managing forests. So they said, write a forest management plan, figure it out. I said, okay, I don't know. And I started to look and research. How do you do this? How do you arrest a century or more worth of degradation quickly What do you do? What do you plant? Where do you get it? What do you kill? How do you kill it? What do I do? So I couldn't find really any great case studies in urban old-growth forests that had been restored. There aren't many urban old-growth forests in any major city around the world. I couldn't find specific information about the species and what would thrive, what wouldn't thrive. So you know what I did? I thought like a gardener. What do gardeners do? Gardeners basically decide what plants they want. They figure out where to get them. They figure out where to plant them, and they know how to take care of them, and because they know they won't take care of themselves, and they take care of them until they more or less can take care of themselves. So my background in horticulture and forest ecology created the first version of the forest management plan that we're currently using. So the first thing you do is you map the problem. This is an early map of invasive species populations. Don't worry about which are which, but you can see they're widespread throughout the forest, various sundry invasive species. Boy, the problem is substantial. We better start working. And then you hire, a mean-looking, rake-wielding, or actually get them to volunteer, even better. You don't have to pay them. Just nasty people who hate weeds as much as you hate weeds. And you let them go, and you make them feel like they're doing good by ruining their backs and what's left of their lives. And you just start going. You start removing invasive species. Because we have the data. We know if we don't remove these things, they're taking over, right? It's 50 acres. Then you bring in the big guns to deal with some of the more problematic issues. We removed about 800 cork trees, including some really big cork trees. They were very well established. This is philodendron. They were just spewing propagules. They were just the future of the forest in tree form. And we cut them down. We chipped them. We used the chips to cover our paths. We did everything we could to try to arrest, to mitigate these negative influences that we were directly responsible for. And then what happens when you remove a whole bunch of cork trees, 800 of them in year one? Well, in year two, 1 billion cork tree seedlings pop up in the space, right? It makes sense. I'm sure many of you are gardeners. Oh my God. So you get your students, you get volunteers, anybody you can to pull those. That is literally a carpet in the forest floor of cork tree seedlings. You just keep at it. And you keep at it long enough that you actually start to make a difference. So again, these are very fancy GIS-generated maps, but the take-home picture here is at the left is based on the 2006 plots, the density of cork tree throughout the forest. So green is not so much, red is a lot, right? So that's 2006. and 2011, you can say we've made a substantial dent just by going after it. And that's what you do. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Believe me, the story is not over yet, right? This started as just a kind of a small thing, and then we built it and built it and built it, and now we have wonderful support. We have a program. I have 2 full-time forest gardeners, basically, and a director, and we have so many volunteers and great students. People are really, really engaged in this sort of work because they can see themselves making a difference over time. However, it's not all good because nature abhors a vacuum. And Aurelia alata, a Japanese angelica tree, which is in the forest, which we knew about, which seemed easy to us. I don't know if you guys know it, but it's a nasty thing. It's got spines all over it. But you get a weed wrench, you just pop it out, it comes right out of the ground, and you're done. Well, it turns out if you do that, it leaves little root fragments, and they sprout, and you make lots more of them. And so those gaps created by removing the philodendron and doing this active management created great conditions for Aurelia. So now we're going after Aurelia. We're undaunted, undaunted. We're going after it. And I'm hoping in 5 years when you have me back, that map will be like the other one. There'll be something else that'll pop up, right? But you can't just remove the invasives. You have to plant something in their space, right? Nature abhors a vacuum. You can call it filling the niche. You can call it filling in the available growing space. You can call it whatever you want to call it. But if you're not planting in that space, what you will get in our forest and in any place invaded by invasives is more invasives. More of the same, fancy new ones that are coming in all the time. You'll get more invasives. So we've been working to collect seed from the local germplasm, meaning from plants within the forest itself, mostly because that seems like the right thing to do. You can argue both ways, back and forth, about whether or not I should be getting it from more southerly populations because they're better adapted to a changing climate. The reality is no one knows the answer to that. They're free because they're there, and that's helpful. And so we're growing things on, but things like oaks, we have these tarps out in the forest, and we're racing the squirrels to get the acorns or the hickory nuts, and to try to keep that germplasm alive. Because we are the reason the squirrels are so dense, because we've created the perfect habitat for them. So we figure it's the least we can do to try to give oaks a fighting chance. We've also been planting herbaceous species throughout. We don't have the deer problem that you have here, so we have a really lush understory, but we've lost so many of the wildflowers and herbaceous plants that once grew in the forest. And we're not exactly sure why. Maybe it's soil compaction, maybe it's over-collecting, maybe it's heavy metal concentrations. Who knows? So we're planting, we don't have local material to grow, but we have regional material, and we'll see what happens. And we're learning, we're figuring out what the right thing to do, what's the right density that we plant these at, how many different populations do we pull from when we do our planting, and then we're always, from beginning to end, being extremely self-critical. We're analyzing our work, and we're willing to change on a dime. We don't think that anything we're doing is right. I'm not here to tell you how to do it. I'm here to say this is what we're doing, and this is what we're seeing so far, and we will continue to adapt our approaches over time. One wonderful story is Anemone quinquefolia. There was one tiny little population of it remaining in the forest. It was self-sterile. It wasn't producing any seeds. So we got some regional pollen from some plants regionally. We pollinated it. We collected the seeds. We grew on the seedlings. We planted it in the forest. And we're seeing those small patches of this little five-flowered or five-lobed anemone thriving. So from the charismatic oaks to the smallest herbaceous plant, we're just trying to see if we can reestablish these populations and get them going. We know that if we stop our work tomorrow, everything will go in the opposite direction. So this is an interesting, just if you're thinking about doing this, which I hope that you are actually, these are the number of hours of staff, and the staff and volunteers have dedicated to 3 key activities since 2008. So let's take 2014. It's over 3,000 hours of work doing, this is for 50 acres, mind you, bless you, 50 acres, 50 acres, tiny in comparison to all that's out there. 3,000 hours of invasive species management, a little bit more than 1,000 in maintaining trails, and a little bit more than 500 hours each year in doing plantings. It's a huge commitment of resources. We're fortunate at the garden to have full-time staff devoted to this and to have students and interns and volunteers interested in helping us. And we believe that if we can't do this successfully, I have a hard time imagining it happening in a larger scale elsewhere. But we're trying, and we think we can. Very quickly, I'll go through some other things about the forest that we've been doing. Of course, the trails. The garden is a public place. We're an educational institution. We want people to come and enjoy the forest, but we don't want them to trample all of our plants to death. It doesn't help when you have trails that are muddy after it rains every time, and they'll walk off the trails, and and all the things that they're obvious. So we worked with Andrew Pogue Associates to create a new approach to trail surfacing, which is quite wonderful. We created these wonderful stone fords in places where water crosses the trail. We went from custom-made fence posts, where our arborists would have to actually cut a branch and slice it and do this and that and the other thing to install a fence, to just oak and locust post and rail fence that you can get anywhere. We've created a far more welcoming forest, and people are staying on the trails because the trails are a pleasant place to be. We took an old, you see that nasty old piece of concrete down the bottom. This is like a culvert where there was an ephemeral stream, just terrible. We built a beautiful arched bridge, and we're creating lots of moments throughout the forest with signage and interpretation that bring people in and teach them about what they're seeing. And we hope that inspire them to believe that these things are worth protecting going forward. We're studying animals as well. It's not just plants. Wonderful groups of professionals and volunteers. We have, you see the great horned owl, nesting great horned owls on the right-hand side in the crook of the branch. Foxes. We're doing a long-term study of salamanders, who are great indicators of forest health. We have 2 species of salamanders that seem to be doing pretty well. And again, we'll continue to study those populations to see if our management activities have any impact on populations of other living things in the forest. Then, you deal with things that you didn't expect. There's my new bridge. That's sandy. 167 trees, 6 inches in diameter and larger, blown over, including 70 huge trees. And that's a disturbance like that. And our forest is an old-growth forest. It's been dealing with these things for 6,000 or 7,000 years. It's been continuously forested for that long, but never in the context of that 1950 and up. And so what I know in my heart of hearts, I can't prove it, that if we hadn't begun the process of restoration pre-Sandy, this would have been the event that made us say, "Oh, screw it. It's not worth it." It would have been beyond our ability to do the work. We would have felt like there was no way to get caught up. So that's providence, that's good luck, that's dumb luck, you call it what you will. But Sandy happens and we're equipped to manage. So we're monitoring the canopy gaps created by the loss of trees. We're doing everything we can to learn from this and move forward. So there's the Bronx River and a dam created by the Lorillard family in the 19th century today, and the forest is a glorious and wonderful place. I invite you all to come and visit and maybe pull out a weed or 2. So what time is it now? 20 after. Oh, okay, great. Got a bust to move. So that was the forest. I'm going to go quickly with the native plant garden. What I wanted to do tonight is give 2 different ways that you can reintroduce and re-engage with nature and biodiversity. Ecological restoration in the forest is one, but we're also a garden-y place. And you can do a lot of good in your garden. You don't need to go restore a forest or a marsh or a wetland. There's lots of things you could do. So we built a native plant garden. We've always had a native plant garden because of our long history studying native plants. We talked about that a little bit. Britton actually wrote the book about the plants of northeastern North America. His wife was an early advocate for preserving native plants, a great expert in mosses. The original native plant garden was named in her honor. And that was the original native plant garden, which had a very long and interesting story, which I will tell next time I come out here. But suffice it to say, it was a large lawn with a pine barrens and a few other kind of attempts at teaching people about large ecosystems on a small scale. It was a horticultural failure. Unless you love native plants, which I did, and there were great plants in the garden, you would no more go into that garden to look. You were not drawn in for any way, reason, or purpose. So we had the opportunity to restore it. A wonderful site that connects the forest to the heart of the garden, the center of the garden, very diverse conditions. We said, let's make a garden that's first and foremost a garden. That's beautiful. That's going to draw people in whether or not they care about native plants. That's going to show them that native plants can be great elements in the garden, and all the other things that come with them are just a bonus. So that was the philosophy behind the garden. We worked with Oehme van Sweden, the great American landscape architects, to build, rather than a series of ecosystems across the site, just very broad strokes. We have woodland, we have water, we have meadow. Because we have shade, dry, shade, wet, wet, sun, dry. And then let's plant plants that do well in those conditions. Starting with the meadow, again, as it goes from the center of the garden up, from very wet to very dry. Working with Oehme van Sweden, they're great artists with plants. They created plant palettes that are very rich, and using plants that will thrive in wet conditions, in full sun, medium conditions in full sun, and dry conditions. Lots of beautiful plants. Many of these are already popular garden plants. That's the site before we started. You can see a lot of lawn, not very promising. Came through lots of heavy equipment, Any good garden needs a lot of heavy equipment. And the great paradox of meadow making is that you have to spend a lot of money to make your soil as bad as possible, because apparently these plants will only thrive in poor soils or have competitive advantage in poor soils. Different story for a different time. So we spent a lot of money to make the soils as bad as possible. And then we planted a lot of plants, mostly plugs. We opted to not do the broadcast seeding that some people do because we wanted to have a lot more control over the meadow in years 1 through 5. So planted a gazillion little plugs from various nurseries, and then Irene came. Literally, we finished planting these the Saturday morning before Hurricane Irene. They were fine. Everything was fine because we spent a lot of money to make crappy soil, and everything was fine. It was very well drained. Everything was good, and they got established. So that's the following, like 3 or 4 days later. That's 2 years later in the spring. Just a couple of great shots. Tradescantia and Coreopsis of various species. A little bit later in the series, Liatris, some Retibita, Echinacea. Even later in the season, Eupatorium, Solidago, lots of grasses, all on what used to be a lawn. The woodland at the edge of the forest, very important site. Again, working with Oehme van Sweden to protect the existing trees as best we could, and to take advantage of the habitat they created. And to create a palette of plants that includes a lot of our favorite spring ephemeral wildflowers. That's the way the old woodland in the native plant garden looked. There's the forest just beyond. So it was nice, woodlandy, but not a garden. We had to make a garden. So again, you spend a lot of money on the soil. You raise the soil a little bit, make it rich in organic material so that the tree roots don't go right into it and rob your new plants of water and nutrients. Spent a lot of money on plants. You can see the taping out. This is Oehme van Sweden, famous for their big sweeps. Everything's got to be a big sweep and legible. You plant. This is March. A few months later, it's still pretty nice. A year later, it's a garden. It's gorgeous. It's fantastic. And that's the garden in the summer, right? So the spring ephemerals are done. Sorry, you have to make sure that it follows to something. So a wonderful tableau of ferns and other shade-tolerant plants that come up. Water feature that takes advantage of the wet center of the garden. It actually recirculates water that it's all captured on site. It's pumped through a biofiltration wetland, an engineered wetland at the top, which includes a lot of really wonderful plants, including golden club, pitcher plants, the wonderful hibiscus. That was what it was. It was a drainage ditch in the middle of a lawn. Doesn't really look promising, and looks a lot less promising a little bit way into it. Lots of big equipment, lots of money again, but it's starting to shape up, and that's it when it was complete. This garden was designed to be a contemporary garden. The thought being that it was opened in 2013. Let's build it according to the design principles of 2013 and not try to make it look like it was here in 1904, because the garden has all these wonderful bits that were very much of their era. The Rose Garden, Beatrix Farron, is 1916. The conservatory is 1900, and so on and so forth. So I love contemporary gardens. I love contemporary design. So it's very contemporary both in its philosophy, but also in the way it was designed and planted. That's the cardinal flower and the water feature in spring, midsummer, fall, quite beautiful. We protected all the native trees that define the site. Even in winter, it's pretty magical. We also have a native border, which is a little bit of a horticultural confection. It's not a habitat or ecosystem, but it sort of distills plants from within the larger garden and presents them in a very horticultural way right at the entrance. So this, if you have a small border, we hope it will inspire you to do a border of only native plants. There it is in the spring, wonderful Geranium maculatum. You can see the penstemon coming up, golden Alexanders, dogwoods in the background, all the way through the fall with asters and maturing grasses. It's really quite wonderful throughout all seasons. And of course, the whole native plant garden is a paradise for pollinators and seed dispersers and frogs and snapping turtles and every bit of life. And it's quite wonderful. You forget very much when you're at the garden that you're in the city, that you're in the Bronx. And you read a lot about how these plants will do these things for these organisms, but you always remain skeptical if you're like me. And then you build it and they show up and they're there, and the dragonflies are out of control and the bees are out of control and the birds are, and it's different. And our bird watchers who come there all the time say, this is the best place in the garden to watch birds now because you guys have done this thing, which is very gratifying. Probably more so for the birds than for us, but it's good. All right, so that's it. If you do come to the garden, our call exhibition is up through November 1st. Please do. It's beautiful 12 months a year, I believe. People often ask me when the best time to come is, and I say in February when none of the rest of you are around. But really, any time of year. The fall is quite magical. If you want to see the Frida exhibition and see the garden's incredible tree collections and forest, October is spectacular. But come tomorrow if you have time. All right, that's it. There's a first question.
On the earlier slide, on your climate, what accounts for something?
In the average temperatures?
That's what it looked like.
Yeah, so I just have to say the slide. So if it were average temperatures, that's the climate is average over time. So if you have a volcano erupt in the Philippines, I don't know in 1950 what it was, but you can have a cool year within a hot trend. And that's why it's so difficult to convince naysayers about climate change, because they'll always use the example of, well, it was really cold last winter. How's that, climate change people? I was freezing this winter. Climate change. Bring it on. You know what I mean? It's just because you're looking at averages, and at any point, as you look at an average, the actual weather is going to change.
Todd, be sure to repeat the question.
Oh, yes. The question was, in 1950, there seemed like there was a drop in average temperatures rather than an increase. Why is that? Thank you. All right, all the way in the back? Oh, it's such a good question. The question is, why didn't you plant hemlocks if they're so beautiful and there were so many? And the answer to that question is, I know if I plant a hemlock, I have to spray it to keep it alive. I just do. It's going, the pest is there, it's well established. And for a million different reasons, resources, time, philosophy, I know that there are 50 appropriate things that I can plant there. Why would I plant the thing that I know I would have to do even more care to keep it alive? So it's triage, it's for a lot of reasons. Does that answer the question?
It does.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes?
What is the tick situation there?
The question is, what is the tick situation there? Every time I see a rabbit, it's got a tick on it, like big, nasty clusters of ticks on their ears. I don't get ticks at work very often. We don't have deer. The deer wander through. We don't have deer populations. I haven't seen a deer tick there. I haven't seen a Lone Star tick there. Better place to volunteer than out here, maybe.
How much do we spray?
The question is, how much do we spray? How much do we spray what?
Well, no, to protect the plants, you said you'd have to spray the hemlock. How much do you spray to protect the plants you do that?
So, well, I can answer that question about hemlocks. So we do have hemlocks remaining. The question is, how much do we spray in general? And I'm answering how much do we spray hemlocks. We do have hemlocks remaining in our living collections, particularly some really stunning Sargent's weeping hemlocks that are about 100 years old. If you don't know them, it's a weeping form. And so we treat them with horticultural oil every year. It's maybe 15 plants. But garden-wide, we practice integrated pest management. So we respond to whatever the stress is with the best possible, according to our knowledge, response. And in some cases, that would include spraying with an insecticide. In other cases, it would mean doing nothing. So it changes from year to year. It depends on the pest pressure. Back in the back. Yes. Sure. So the question is about Central Park Splendor, which is a cultivar of Ulmus parvifolia, which is an Asian elm that Arthur, the individual tree along Central Park East, I believe, or whatever it is, it's, yeah, 72nd Street. Yeah, it's gone. Fell in love with the tree because it was glorious. Apparently it had been a gift to New York City from the King of Prussia in the 19th century.
100 years old.
Yeah. So, and Arthur fell in love with it and worked with David Michener, David Karnofsky in Michigan, I believe, ultimately, and then in Michigan, to propagate it and distribute it. And we have a number of those specimens, actually young ones, growing at the garden today. I think it is resistant. It's never had it at the garden. Nothing that I know of is immune to it, so it's not immune, but it's resistant. That's a great question. The question was, basically, in our effort to modernize and to feed our families and to grow, have we forsaken nature and in the direction of money and success? And I would say no. I would say that human activity has had a huge impact on the planet, but so has human ingenuity done tremendous to preserve and protect nature. John Muir, the list goes on. I mean, there's so many great people who've studied nature, who help us better understand it. So I think it's a fair fight between the devil on the one shoulder and the angel on the other. My money is ultimately on the angel because I think that we are a rational creature, and rational creatures understand that you can't destroy the very thing that sustains you if you want to be sustained over time. How's that for unbridled optimism? Yes.
Is there discussion at the garden, or is that just not possible?
So the question was, does the sort of exotic horticulture side of the garden take into consideration potential invasiveness when incorporating new collections? The good thing is that I am responsible for both. I am the yin and the yang, and we are very careful. And we don't always know. There's often not very much information about whether something is or is not invasive. So we look at kind of broad things. Is it bird dispersed? Is it rhizotomous? Does it produce a huge amount of seed? Is it highly drought tolerant? Is it highly shade tolerant? And then we'll never plant something on a broad scale if we don't know about its long-term invasiveness. But we will make mistakes, I promise you.
I see circles on all these maps. Are they sprinklers?
Circles on these maps, are they sprinklers? The question is, are the circles on the map sprinklers? And I'll have to look at the circle to let you know. So those circles are tree canopies. So in that case, those are, in this particular drawing, the herbaceous plants are all identified by the beautiful kind of hatching, colored pencil, and the trees are identified by the very...
Do you use irrigation?
We do use irrigation. The question is, do we use irrigation? We do. We installed, not garden-wide irrigation, we don't have it in the forest, but through much of our managed and planted landscape, we added irrigation in the mid-2000s. Thank goodness, because without it, we would have lost a lot of trees. Yes?
I live in Nepede State Park, and
Okay.
place.
The question was, is your taste so bad, and are you so flagrantly irresponsible to include bamboo in the New York Botanical Garden? Yeah. And I don't know how to answer that question. We do have bamboo, but we don't have a lot of bamboo. And I agree, it is a very odd thing to see, particularly Philostachys, the green one, which you'll see these walls of it in places that are they just don't work with our landscape very well. So I personally wouldn't plant a running bamboo really anywhere. We do plant, there's some clumping or very kind of weakly running bamboos that we have in small demonstrations. New York has gotten its act together in terms of invasive species regulations, and there are, I think, much to the dismay of the nursery industry, who sees this from a very different perspective, increasing number of plants that cannot be sold legally in New York, which again, half of me thinks is a great thing, but half of me wonders how the nursery industry, which is essential to the green industry, which I am a card-carrying member of. So hopefully hopefully we'll work together to make rational choices for the long-term health of our planet. And I will say that the vast majority of non-native species are not problematic. If you can look at the garden as having grown, you name it, it's been grown at the garden, and only a very small handful of things have become problems. Yes?
There are two species of particular types we do if we want to help those populations here.
Okay, so the question is, what can we do to help monarch butterflies and honeybees? I'm not an entomologist, but I've read the things that you have, and we know that monarch butterflies depend on milkweed for an important part of their life cycle, both to feed their larvae, their young, for oviposition, but also for nectar. So a very simple thing people could do is plant milkweed in their gardens. And there are actually kind of a growing number nationwide of efforts to plant more milkweed. So you can learn a lot about that. I'm not an expert, but we planted a lot of milkweed in the native plant garden. I planted milkweed in my own garden. In terms of honeybees, they're really just beginning to understand colony collapse disorder. I think that relatively recently, they've associated it with neonicotinoids, which are pesticides based on nicotine. And so reducing the use of those. I don't think that anybody who is not a licensed pesticide applicator, who has not gone through the mandatory training about not only the possible impacts of pesticides on human health, but on their ecology, their chemistry, if you haven't done that training, you shouldn't apply. I mean, as far as I'm concerned. If you have done that training, you're going to apply responsibly. So I would never support a wholesale ban, but certainly informed use would be a nice place to start for everything, not just those two organisms. Yeah. So the question is about the Million Tree Project in New York City. Does the garden have a role in that? And I was on the, I was a member of the technical board of the Million Trees New York, which is a partnership between the Parks Department and the New York Restoration Project. So I sat on that board for a few years. One, personally, and then the garden is always looked to as a resource for anybody who works with trees or nature or gardening in the city, because we've been there for a long time, and we've done everything wrong at least once. And that's a great place to learn. Yes?
Is it really a problem for you?
Yes, so the question is why with red-tailed hawks and foxes and red foxes and great horned owls, which we saw, would the squirrels be so bad? They're just way more squirrels than those things can eat. Red-tailed hawks are actually very territorial, and they can manage a squirrel every day or so, or every other day or so. And we have thousands upon thousands of squirrels. There just aren't enough predators. That's the main thing. And there's so much food for them. All right. One more question, then we have to go. Yeah. The question is about black squirrels. Because of does the garden have them? And we do. And the reason why black squirrels is that because the squirrel populations are so high, every color variant is expressed. The genetics are there. There are no predators. And you can imagine that actually as being a squirrel, being black in a forest that's predominantly gray in the winter is actually not a good thing. So that. Yeah, there's a preponderance of the garden too. In fact, people who are there the first time, oh my God, there are black squirrels. But we have red. These are all eastern gray squirrels. We have eastern gray squirrels that are red, that are brown, that are black. We have every color variant. Yes, in the back. The question is, do all species of bees pollinate? And if I had not been to the lecture this morning, I would have said I have no idea. But because I did go to the wonderful lecture hosted by the East Hampton Garden Club and the Nature Conservancy, I can say yes, but not all equally effectively. In fact, there are many, many more native species of bees in North America that you would never have heard of, that don't produce honey, but are very important and efficient pollinators, and that the European honeybee, which is actually probably an African species, is an okay pollinator, but a great producer of honey. So if you want all of these native plants to thrive, you have to protect not only the European honeybee, but the broad populations of native bees, including bumblebees and carpenter bees and sweat flies and hoverflies and all these species that grow. I think that's it. I was told. I'm sorry. Thanks.